it is a great day in the Ann Arbor Public Schools as we come on this pre-November, pre-Thanksgiving board meeting, as we do every year, to review our annual audit. I'm so grateful to Mario Dimitriou and our finance team for all of their work. Trustees, you know, but our community may not recognize that they start this process in the spring and summer and do lots and lots of work, and then Laura Claeys and the Plante and Moran team fall into place along August, September, October, and do their internal and exterior analysis of our fiscal well-being. For those in the audience and the trustees, you have the materials in front of you, but all of the documents, and they're heavy, are provided on our website. It's part of our transparency, so you'll be able to find all of those items there on the website at any time to review the fiscal condition of the district. We pride ourselves in paying close attention to our numbers and in doing the very best that we can with the resources that we have. So it is an important day, and our auditors will share this evening, Ms. Claeys, that this is a clean audit with no findings. So we'll celebrate that right off because there are many districts and organizations in the country that are not able to say that. So we're very grateful that it is a clean audit. We're coming up to Thanksgiving, as we said earlier, and this is a time to be grateful for the progress that we've made in this district. And I want to thank our teachers, our support staff, our administrators, our parents, and the strong support of our community who also contribute to the quality work that we accomplish for our students. We don't just look at the numbers as numbers. We look at the numbers and think about what opportunities and exceptional education that we can provide for the children of Ann Arbor and for our future. That's what this audit means to those of us in this work. We appreciate the Ann Arbor community, as you will see early on in Ms. Claeys' presentation, through our 2015 bond, our technology bond, and our sinking fund. We've generated and used this year approximately $12.8 million that were locally generated. And without those dollars, this audit story would be it would be a dramatically different story for quality education for children. And I want the community to know we never take that support for granted. There's not many communities that have the level of local support that we do. And it has made the difference in this downturn and in this time of precious little resources from our state. And we know that every dollar raised locally frees up the other dollars we have to spend on programming and services for students and salaries and benefits for our hardworking staff. When we think about our fiscal resources in public pre-K-12 education, we specifically consider the trust that our community places in us to use every penny wisely. We measure our stewardship in terms of how we may manage, how we may leverage the dollars to provide even more for our children in services and programs and top quality educational experiences like this beautiful Steinway piano that you won't see in just every school district in our state. We also consider our fiscal responsibility in terms of serving as excellent stewards of the schools and the properties that have been placed in our care. I get to sit with the board in executive session, and I can say with confidence to the community that they really are deeply thoughtful about every dollar that we use. Boards sat at tables before this board and made decisions that have provided for these beautiful buildings, and we take that responsibility very seriously as we move forward. So as we make fiscal decisions, and you'll see this in the audit this evening, we are always balancing resources with needs. And certainly, as we look tonight and see that our per pupil funding for 2016-17, this audit year, we're just coming to the level of where our funding was in 2003. Yes, you heard me correctly. 14 years of downturn, and we're just coming back to where we were 14 years ago in our per pupil funding, and that is not differentiated for inflation. Those are actual dollars to dollars. So you can see that these decisions that are represented in this audit tonight, that our board and our administrative team and our community makes through their input and feedback, these are very critical decisions that are balancing need and resource across the organization and across our community. We also must balance what is anticipated from the state. And for previous years, for example, in this audit year, the addition from the state was $60 per student. Folks who don't work with this all the time might say, wow, that sounds wonderful. $60 a student in the Ann Arbor Public Schools is the equivalent of a little less than $1 million. So it's about 1/230th of our budget. And so you can see that those kinds of increases from the state do not even cover your cost of living and cost of normal operation increases. So we have work to do, and this audit represents a great year of work. We achieved wins for students in this 2016 year, and I know that Ms. Osinski, Ms. Helton are going to put up a slide as we look back over this year to say, you know what, Plante Moran and Mr. Dimitri are bringing us an audit. What did that get us for children? Look at what we were able to do. We added behavior interventionists to support with meeting student needs and helping our most vulnerable students to be successful at school. And the community has seen, and our board has seen the results of that team. We reduced class sizes, and that report, trustees, is coming at your next meeting, but class sizes are better in 2016-17 than they had been for approximately 6 years prior to that year. New lows in class sizes, particularly at middle and high school levels. We had always, the board had been very clear about holding elementary sizes, but this year we really got to middle and high school groups. We also reduced the number of combined grade classes, and that had been at a high of 18 in the fall of 2013. And these are combined grade classes, not by design, not like we do at Ann Arbor Open and at Angel and in those great places, but combined class sizes that we do in order to save money, in order to make sure that we're conserving resources. We were able to complete the Project Lead the Way implementation. We became the first district in the state of Michigan to have Project Lead the Way in all 32 campuses. And I can tell you, we see the benefits of that already. We increased employee compensation. So while we anticipated, as we came into this year, the trustees have discussed this, we were very open about it, we anticipated going a little bit behind during this fiscal year. We are proud to say that this audit is coming in right at, trustees, what you expected back on June 30th, because the way your fiscal year works, you pass a budget blind, and then we work that out as we move through the year. It is the way the state requires us to do it. But we're proud to say that we came out exactly where we thought. And when we consider that we managed the Allen flood event disaster, on top of these great resources that we were able to put in for students, I would put this fiscal year in the W column. It was a win for children and it was a win for our community. Of course, most of the costs on Allen were reimbursed by the insurance company, but the board knows well that the rental and day-to-day costs, the transportation to move those students back and forth every day, and all of the indirect costs of Allen, you'll see it in this audit. It swells many lines throughout our budget. And yet we were able to achieve a beautiful renovation of Allen, and that story ended well, and we're coming out on our audit exactly where we thought. So I just want to thank again our board for their courageous leadership, our staff for all of the hard work and the sacrifices that they make. We never take for granted the dollars that are entrusted to us on the behalf of children. We want to serve as responsible stewards, and it is our commitment to leverage what we have to achieve real wins for students, and always balancing those urgent, pressing needs with mid and long-range planning for the health of the organization. The trustees have the most recent letter from Moody's. This was a great question that came from Trustee Mitchell last week. And we'll just draw your attention to the Ann Arbor Public Schools Moody rating AA2. And that is an underlying rating of our fiscal health. And trustees, it's a testament to your leadership in being able to both offer quality programming for children and also to keep our district fiscally strong. So with that, I thank you for this great year of fiscal responsibility. And now it is our great pleasure and honor to hear from Ms. Claeys, who knows our budget inside and out. So she'll be coming to share that with you. And then Mr. Demetrio, Ms. Claeys will be available for whatever questions that you may have. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here this evening to go through the financial highlights for the audit for the year ended June 30, 2017. Included in your board packet, you received a copy of the basic financial statements, the federal awards report, and a letter to the Board of Education with items for your consideration. What we'll be focusing on this evening is the slide deck that you received this evening and you do have on your technology. As Dr. Swift mentioned, all school districts in Michigan are required by state law to have an audit. All schools have a June 30 year end, and you are required to file that audit with the state of Michigan no later than November 1st. So we're pleased to report that you did file that audit on time. And as was mentioned in Dr. Swift's opening comments, based on the audit procedures that we performed and the tests that we do and the confirmations that we do with outside agencies, we rendered an unmodified or a clean opinion. So for the community members, that's the highest form of assurance that you can receive from an outside auditing firm, and it means that we're not aware of any changes that need to be made to the financial statements in order for them to be issued in accordance with the regulations. In addition to the basic financial statement audit, we also performed an audit of your federal programs. And as a board member and a community member, that's where you're looking to the back of that report to see if there are any findings or any question cost. And we are pleased to report that based on the testing that we did for your federal programs, there are no findings and no question cost. And that's really impressive because you have over $8 million worth of federal expenditures that you process during the year. And as you're well aware, those federal regulations become more complicated each and every year. So congratulations to all of you on receiving a clean report in that regard. So what are some highlights for the year ended June 30, 2017? As you'll see in some of our future slides, the enrollment in the district continues to grow year over year, which is a testament to the programming that you have and the decisions that you're making along the way, and we'll show the impact that that has on the financial results. You have continued to make investments in the classrooms, and you achieved the goal, as was mentioned, of reducing the class sizes and reducing the number of combined grade classes that you had throughout the district. And that comes with balancing the resources that you have with the needs that you have within the classrooms. We are going to spend all of our time tonight talking about the general fund in the graphs that we have, but I did want to point out that you had $4.6 million in current year capital investments, and those were taken care of through the technology bond and the 2015 bond funds, which were of course approved by the voters in the community, as well as the fact that you have the sinking fund, and that provided $8.2 million in funding that was spent on capital investments in the district. So were those items not in place, that $12.8 million, you would have had to pay for that out of the general fund. So that does provide some support so you can spend those general fund dollars in the classroom. But what are the challenges? As was mentioned, you do need to constantly challenge yourself and balance the additional programming and the decisions that you're making with the resources that you have within the district, recognizing that when you make decisions today, they can represent investments that will be made for the future. You also need to look at that with funding that comes from the state and how those dollars are spent. If they are recurring, ongoing expenditures, what might that impact be on the long-term financial stability of the district? And I wouldn't be able to walk away without just reminding you that despite the fact that you spent $12.8 million in capital items this past year, you do have a significant amount of infrastructure needs, as you're well aware. So you're in a situation now where maybe you're catching up on items that had been deferred over a period of time, and then you'll be in a situation where you want to keep up on those capital investments to make sure that the buildings are in the best shape possible for the students. So let's talk about some of the numbers. This first slide that you see here is looking at the general fund, which is your primary operating fund, comparing the budget to actual results. On the far left column is the budget that you approved all the way back in May of 2016, before you even knew what fiscal 17 would look like. And as you can see, you thought your total revenue would be $215 million. Then when you worked your way through the process and you filed your final amended budget in May of 2017, you had increased the total revenue expectation to $235.3 million. The majority of that delta from $215 million to $235 million really represents about $6 million more in local revenue, just about $6 million more from the state based on enrollment increases, and then you had additional funding of $8.6 million from the intermediate school district for special education funding. And then that blue column on the left shows your final results. The final revenue for the year ended June 30th, 17 was $233 million. What you will note is that in each of those columns, we have a highlighted item of $14.3 million. And what that represents is money that you get from the state of Michigan. It's called Section 147C money. It's allocated to you, and it really represents dollars for the MIPSers retirement system. So they provide it to you in revenue, and then you have to turn right around and pay it back to the state. And the reason that we call that out is really because the contributions that you are required to make to the retirement system, and we'll talk about that more in the future, those are not going to go away. But if the state were to decide to legislate out and not provide that $14 million worth of revenue to you, that expenditure would still exist, which is why we highlight it there for your consideration. On the expenditure side, you can see the exact same thing happening. So $215 million approximately of expenditures increased to $235 million through that final budget amendment, and then the final expenditures were $235.2 million for the year ended June of 17. So we'll talk about that a little further. So what we like to look at here is really what happened with your change in fund balance. So I'll draw your attention to that center column. So you started the year, July 1st, 2016, with $21.5 million of fund balance. You had revenue of $233 million, expenditures of $235 million. So you actually utilized some of your fund balance. You had expenditures greater than revenue of $2.1 million. Then you had some transfers that came into the district of $530,000, so the net reduction in your fund balance for the year was $1.6 million. When you look to the far left, or the far right, excuse me, you'll see the variances from your budget. And so what I want to point out there is in the revenue side, you were under budget by about $2.3 million. That really represents timing differences. When you budget your grants, you budget for the full amount of the grant. Those grants typically run 18 to 24 months. Some of that activity is now happening in fiscal 18. So there isn't any difference there. You will get the revenue. It's just the period in which you record it. And if you look at that variance percentage, it's 1%. So even though $2 million seems like an awful lot of money, if you think about it, if your budget were only $100, you would be off by 1 penny. So it's something to just remember that you do monitor this very closely, as was evidenced by the monthly report that you just looked at, so you know what's happening on an ongoing basis. The other two items I'd like to point out are again in that center column. So the ending fund balance at June 30, 2017 was $19.8 million. And the metrics just below that are ones that we get asked about a lot by community members. So your fund balance, that $19.8 million, as a percentage of expenditures, is 8.5%. It just so happens that it's pretty close to the same percentage as you relate to revenue, because revenues and expenditures are so close. That is a metric that you should watch very closely, and it is certainly one that the state of Michigan watches very closely, and we'll talk about why in a few moments. The other piece of that is that days of operation. Because you have a very large budget, it is sometimes easy to get swayed by the numbers. So your fund balance is $19.8 million. If we divide that out in terms of days of operations that would fund, if you were to receive no more revenue from the state, the federal government, anywhere else, you would be able to operate for 31 days, and then you would have no more fund balance and you'd be out of money. And comparatively, that number was 37 days last year. So that's a metric that you should continue to watch. One of the questions that came up to us at the Finance Committee is, well, what should that number actually be? Days of operations. Is 31 a good number? What number should that be? And it really just depends. It should be as large as you can possibly make it, but that's that tenuous balance again between how you spend your resources today and tomorrow. So if you were to say that you wanted fund balance to be about 10% of your expenditures, that would represent 36 and a half days of operations. And if you said, I really want 45 days worth of operations, then you would have to have fund balance of $28.9 million. So another $10 million would have to be added. So just metrics to keep in mind so you know where you're at all points in time. So let's look at the fund balance. This is the cumulative results of the district since it's been in inception. And on the far left column, your fund balance back in 2008 was $31.9 million. And you'll see at the bar at the very bottom, we indicated what your fund balance was as a percentage of expenditures. So back then it was 16.3%. And you can see as you move forward in time, and we'll talk about how this happened, you did have a point in time where in 2013 and 14, your fund balance was $9.5 or $8.8 million in those 2 consecutive years, and it was less than 5% of your expenditures. And the reason why that's important, and we've drawn the red line there on the graph, is the state has put in place legislation called early warning legislation, where they want to monitor districts that they think could be fiscally unstable. And one metric that they look at is if your fund balance is less than 5%. And so that's something that you always want to monitor. We'll keep that on the graph there for you. And you can see as you've moved forward in 15, 16, and 17, you've been able to add to your fund balance. And at June 30, 2017, you are at 8.5% of expenditures, well above that 5% line. The other item to point out, though, is at the very top, and you may miss it, is that blue line. So if you were to have 15% fund balance, and that is a target that's put out there by the state associations that we participate in, the Michigan School Business Officials, they would recommend that you have a 15% fund balance. You could see that your fund balance would have to be close to $35 million in order to meet that metric. This slide here shows the change in fund balance in each given fiscal year. So while this previous slide talked about your cumulative fund balance, this talks about change in one given year. So the reason that we put this here is to see how far you've come and things to continue to monitor. So June 30, 2013, you actually used $7.2 million of your fund balance. Thankfully, you had it to use, but that comes through tough decision making and the decision not to make significant changes all at one point in time, but you knew that that was not sustainable. In 2014, that improved itself. You only used about $600,000 of fund balance. And then in 2015 and 16, you added to your fund balance. What I do want to draw your attention to, though, is that the additions that you had in 2015 really came about from one-time monies. So you received about $4.6 million from the intermediate school district and another $400,000 in Medicaid funds. So $5 million of that $7 million increase to your fund balance was one-time only money. Correspondingly, in 2016, you also had some one-time only money of $1 million from the sale of Roberto Clemente, and then $3 million from the Ann Arbor District Library interests that you had. So you really had all of that fund balance increase come from one-time only money. This year, you had a reduction in fund balance, as we talked about, and we did footnote that as well. Because of the $1.6 million reduction in fund balance, you had about $1.3 million worth of those direct costs that we were talking about related to the Allen Elementary flood that weren't reimbursed by insurance. And that comes in all forms and fashions, as was mentioned earlier, with transportation and those types of items. So something, again, to monitor because it's a one-time only item. So now if we look at how do you get to your fund balance changes, it's really about revenues and expenditures. So your total revenue for the year ended June of 17 was $233.5 million. As you can see on the slide, the largest component of that, $159.7 million, is the state foundation allowance. So that is the primary source of revenue for the district, and it really is made up of two components, one which you control and one which you really don't. The one you can control is the enrollment. So based on the attraction of the district and the programs that you offer, you have more control over how many students attend here. The foundation allowance is something that the state sets, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. The other large pieces, you had $26.1 million coming from the county through the special education millage, and I know that millage was just renewed, so that provides significant funding to you as well as other districts in the county, so that congratulations on that. And then $14.3 million, that's that retirement amount that we talked about. So you'll see that pop up through a number of slides. And then finally, you had other revenues that come from the state, federal grants, and special ed funding. So as I mentioned before, the things that you can control are the enrollment, and then this is the piece that you can't have as much control over, the foundation allowance. So what you'll see here is a historical look at your foundation allowance. We have one metric out there on its own on the far left for the 2003 funding, and then we have 2007-8 all the way through 16-17. So I'll talk about 2003 in a minute, but 2008 and 2009, you'll see you had $9,600 and $9,700 worth of funding, and there's those orange bars that are sitting there. So not only did you have your foundation allowance, which all districts in the state of Michigan receive, you also had hold harmless or Section 20J funding. And as you can see, as we progress forward, those orange bars went away because the state did away with that type of funding. So that was taken away from you, and that was about $233 per pupil. Then what happened through a series of cuts that the state made to all districts, by the time you work your way through 2010, 11, and 12, you, along with every other district in the state of Michigan, experienced another $470 per pupil cut. So when you combine the $233 that you lost in the 20J funding and the $470 cut that you had along with every other district, you had well over $700 per pupil that was cut in that time frame, or about 7% of the total funding. And then as was mentioned earlier, you can see you had very nominal increases from no increase at all in the years where you had $9,020 and it stayed the same for a couple of years, up to $60 per pupil in additional funding. So even when we get through to 2016-17, as Dr. Swift mentioned, that $9,180 per pupil on the far right, when you compare that to the $9,234 that you received back in 2003, you are not yet back to that number. You will be for fiscal 18, but there's been an awful lot of expenditures that have occurred in that time frame where the funding hasn't kept pace. Mm-hmm. So where can you have more influence? And that would be on the enrollment comparison. So we really do want to congratulate all of you, including the community, all of the staff here, the administration, and the board on the increases that you've had in enrollment. So if you look from 2013-14, which is right in the center of the slide, you had 16,493 students at that point in time. From 2014 forward to the projection through 2018, you've added 1,237 students to the district. So congratulations to all of you on that amazing feat. The percentage increases that we see each year, as well as the pure number of students that you've added, are one of the largest that we see in the state, and that really comes through a lot of hard work and the programming that you offer. One thing to note is oftentimes I think you get asked, well, where are all those students coming from? And I think you only have less than 5% of the students are from outside the Ann Arbor School District footprint. So these are students that live within your boundaries that are making the choice to come back to the district, and that's because of the choices that you're making and providing for them. Okay, on the expenditure side, as I mentioned earlier, total expenditures were $235.2 million. As you would expect, the large blue component represents salaries and benefits, and that should be the largest expenditure in a school district of $177 million. The other piece that's substantial would also be in the retirement funding, and that's the green bar, which is $14.3 million, and that's about 6%. So when you add those items together, you're really looking at about 81% or 82% of total expenditures on people costs. The other large component would be in the red pairing there, which is purchase services of $33.4 million. And as you can see in the footnote, that would be custodial and maintenance costs, transportation costs, technology costs, things along those lines. The other highlight I want to make from this pie chart is when we look at other districts, you'll typically always see another piece of this pie chart that says capital outlay. So back to what we talked about in the beginning, because you've had the technology bond, the 2015 bond, and the sinking fund, you do not have significant capital improvements that are being paid for out of the general fund. So that allows you to deploy those dollars in a different form than other districts might be able to, which is a really good thing. So if we take that salaries and benefits slice as well as that retirement funding piece and we combine those together, that adds up to $191 million. So this slide here takes those salaries and benefits and looks at where those items are being incurred. So the blue component, as you would expect, $116 million, that's on actual salaries and wages. The red component, which is $42.9 million, represents the retirement contributions. And you'll see again, we put that white dashed line to show that of that $42.9 million, 14.3 of that is the pass-through from the state of Michigan. $22.2 million is represented on health insurance costs. $8.4 million represents payroll taxes, and then $1.8 million is other items such as special leave payments, cash in lieu of insurance, or workers' comp. This slide here takes that same $191 million worth of salaries and benefit costs and really looks at how are those dollars being deployed based on state mandated classifications. So the largest component, again in blue, $167.6 million, is being spent on instructional and instructional support. So dollars that directly affect the classroom. And then the next largest component would be $13.6 million, that's in the red component, and that is school building administration. So again, people that are in the buildings having interactions with the students. And you want to see the largest component, which is 95% when we add the blue and the red together. Those are pieces that directly impact the students, and they see that on a more day-to-day basis. Okay, so let's talk about the retirement system for a moment. So as you can see on the far left side, this is the district's required contribution into the statewide retirement system. So as a reminder, any district in the state of Michigan that has collective bargaining agreements is required by law to participate in the Michigan Public Schools retirement system. You don't have any input over the contributions, you don't have any input over how those dollars are invested, and you are told what your contribution rate will be depending upon the plans in which the employees choose. It should be noted that the employees are also contributing to this program, and these dollars that are shown on the slide here are the dollars that the district is expending. So in 2010 and 11, you spent $22.4 million, and as you've moved forward, you can see that those dollars are increasing, and the light blue component on each of the bars starting in 2013 through 2017, those are the pieces that the state has been providing to you that you turn right around and pay back into the retirement system. And you can see how that amount has grown year over year. So the year ended June 30, 2017, the total contribution into the plan was $43.8 million, of which 14.3 of that was provided by the state to then be redeployed back into the system. The other large component on a benefit side is certainly health costs. So you can see this is, again, the district required cost for health insurance for the last several years. And for the last couple of years, 14, 15, and 16, that number had stayed relatively flat. In 2017, we see that number increasing from $20.2 million to $22.5 million. And the primary reason for that is really the change in the hard cap and the amount that the district is paying on behalf of the employees. So we have made a footnote on the bottom here that says the district currently pays a maximum of $12,960 per employee for insurance, which is about a $400 increase from fiscal 16. And again, I do know that each and every one of the employees is also making a contribution towards their health insurance costs. This is just the piece that the district is contributing. So it is an expensive benefit, as we all know, and it is somewhat shared. So we talked about the revenue, we talked about the expenditures, and this slide is again just a recap of what the overall fund balance is for the district, which was a repeat of the slide that we had in the beginning, because each and every year's financial results does have an impact on what that ending fund balance will be, and we just encourage you to continue to monitor that level of fund balance, comparing it as a % of expenditures, as well as watching that early warning line. So what are the key takeaways? As we talked about before, the success of the district really is a community and a district collaboration. The choices that you make here, you're trying to do the best things for the students, the people that work in the district, and certainly the community, and you need their support in order to make some of those things happen. We are very impressed that for the fourth year in a row, enrollment has increased by the largest percentage that we've seen in the last decade, and that current year increase in revenue as a result of those added students did provide about $3.2 million worth of additional revenue. Dr. Swift mentioned $1 million number. That was just looking at that $60 increase in funding. This is looking at the number of students coming in times the foundation allowance. And the reason that those students are coming to the district and staying in the district and returning to the district really is based on those program offerings that you've put out there. And I know you've made decisions at the board table on a number of occasions to put those programs in place. But you also need to watch the cost side of things. So you have improved efficiencies. We encourage you to keep doing that. You should also look at the costs that you have and how well those can be contained, because those items will certainly have a drain on financial resources even when you have enrollment increases. So keeping those things in balance will always be important. So what are the things that you should monitor outside of the Ann Arbor schools, but really just watching what's happening in the environment as a whole? We've listed these items here for you, just a couple things to think about. So paying attention to what's happening at the state level, both in the economy for the state, because they are such a large contributor to the foundation allowance, and then politically what's happening. I know we've been watching what's happening with enhancement millage, we've been watching what's happening with the foundation allowance. Those types of things certainly have an impact on you here in the school district. The same thing will be relative to the retirement contribution rates and what's happening with the retirement system, as well as any other changes that happen in negotiations and things along those lines that will require resources and decisions to be made. And then also look at the options that might be within your control to continue to provide funding for the student population, and we've listed some examples there in the red box on the bottom. So we'd encourage you to keep advocating as you have in the past at the state level. I think it does make a difference, and a lot of the legislators like to hear from people who are at the board table. It helps them make informed decisions as well, even if we may not always agree with how those decisions get played out. Continue to watch the fund balance. I know you monitor those monthly budget reports. Looking at what's happening with the fund balance will help you decide what decisions may or may not need to be made over time. Keep looking at those expenditures and what are market rates for the compensation that you pay across the district, since that is your biggest cost and expense. And then continuing to balance those long-term investments with funding volatility that occurs on a regular basis. And just as a reminder, as we talked about fund balance, just recognize that some of the buildup that you've had in the fund balance over the last several years really came about from one-time only transactions. So we'd really encourage you to use caution when you make decisions as how to use that fund balance, because it might be a one-time expense or it may end up being an annuity, which you have to try and control. With that, I think Dr. Swift had some closing comments.
Well, thank you, Ms. Claeys, and to our team at Plante and Moran. We appreciate your hard work and competent work. I just want to take a moment to again thank our employees of the Ann Arbor Public Schools for their hard work. Spending the money is one thing, but delivering for children is really what matters, and our employees do that every day. So we appreciate that we continue to deliver the Ann Arbor Public Schools difference for our children, and that's what matters most. I want to thank the Board of Education for their support, their advocacy at the state level, and their courageous decision-making. It's hard to make decisions, especially ones that are not popular, and the board has certainly been in that position, and I thank you for leading not only for today but also for the future in the Ann Arbor Public Schools. And finally, as we've shared but will continue to share, is many thanks to our community. This budget would be immensely more challenging if it were not for the support of our local community through our technology bond, our sinking fund, our special ed millage, and all of the ways that our community reaches out to support and to ensure that we have the funds to make that Ann Arbor difference. And so with that, trustees, Mr. Demetriou, Ms. Claeys are ready for your questions and your discussions. My team and I will be taking close notes so that we can answer and provide for any supports that you need. Thank you.
Thank you. I just had a couple maybe bigger picture comments to make. One of them has to do with, and I think people can see the trend of our foundation allowance per student. What would be, I always think of these things at the table, so it's a really great idea, but you have no time to prepare for it. But what would be interesting to see is this same chart, and then on the next y-axis, like a double y-axis chart, would be to lay over the trend on insurance and MIPSers. So you can see that this took a significant drop in certainly by 2011-12. That was probably our nadir of the foundation allowance for the past really almost 20 years. If we looked back even further, we're probably not too far ahead of that as well. And that's the revenue side. And then when we go to the expense side, you can see the cost. And can you go to the MIPSers cost? Just to look at that one alone. Yeah, that one. Our MIPSers expense, which we have, as you said so eloquently, no control over, keeps going up every single year. Now, we do have an offset that the state so far has given us, but should they ever not decide to do that, which is an easy decision they could make in a budget cycle, that 14.3 would be borne by us as well. So that would be all of our expenses with no revenue coming in to offset that. The trend on this, the trend on health insurance, when I've gone to the state to advocate before for better funding for schools, I've shifted my language from when I first started going to Lansing to try to help us with that conversation of total dollars spent on schools, because they are increasing the dollars they spend every year for the school aid fund. Less of it's going to K-12 programming, but they do pass a budget every year, and the school aid fund total dollars has been larger. That's technically correct. What they're not talking about, and what I've shifted my language to talk about, is how many dollars we have that can go to classrooms. And that's a very big difference. So our revenue side basically has gone down or is fairly flat. Our cost side, in things that we even have no control over, MIPSers, health insurance, are on a very different type of trajectory that's mostly a significant increase. This is almost double what it was in 2010-11, 22.4 million to 43.8. That's a significant growth. And that's an expense that we just have to bear. And so that's part of our work, is to help protect dollars that we can spend in our classroom. That affects our students and their experience, our educational experience and quality of experience. I think the other piece I wanted to talk about, two other points. One, Trustee Basquette mentioned unfunded mandates. There's a lot of them. Every time a new bill becomes a law, that sometimes obligates us to more people to deliver or execute that law as designed. A good example that we're living with right in this moment is the third grade reading legislation. One that we had years ago, just to make a finer point, was when the state decided they were no longer going to fund the kindergarten at a full foundation allowance. So if you had a half-day program, your funding per student for every kindergartner going to half-day programs would be cut in half. Our choices were make all of our kindergarten programs full-time, a full day. So we took that choice away from our families. That cost us $1.5 million to do, because we had to hire additional teachers. Or our other choice was to allow the half-day program to continue, in which case we would have lost $3.5 million. These are just things that have been going on for a really long time. And bill by bill, law by law, budget cycle by budget cycle, it erodes what we can do for our classroom. And so our strategy has shifted to one that's primarily local in nature, because people in Ann Arbor value education so much. They understand, even if they don't know all these details, they understand how important adequate funding of public education is. And that brings me to my last point. When we think about not adequate in the sense of what would it take to have a bare minimum set of requirements as adequate. I think that's kind of how Michigan looks at funding in general, and their adequacy studies would say that. That's about $8,000 per student, which is still higher than what we do. If we were to ever think of putting Michigan on a different place in the United States in terms of student achievement, we might look to states that don't just think of education as how can we do the bare minimum or what we would need to do as adequate, but we might look at some top performing states. And I'll mention one that's been in the top spot for the past 5 years, which is Massachusetts. Their average funding from a foundation allowance perspective per student is over $14,000 per student. It's essentially twice what we spend in Michigan per child. So if you have to think about what would it take to do well, not just adequately fund schools, it would be twice what we're doing today to compete at a level or put us on a different place than we are right now. So that's kind of the whole picture that we look at when we think about these budgets. We do try to continue to advocate, although our strategy has shifted a little bit to be more about what's available to us to spend in the classroom, because some of these things we don't have any control over. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to go argue in Lansing about them. They're on their own path. But we do want our legislators to understand what we can put in the classroom for paying our teachers, our support staff that help make the teaching environment a good environment. Those are the things that matter a lot about what the educational quality and experience is for every student that we have. So those are things that matter. And then, of course, we've shifted really to look here in Ann Arbor, in our district, for what we think adequate funding would be and opportunities that we have, which aren't a lot, but we do try to have opportunities that we put in front of our constituents when we can, to help more adequately fund education to the extent that this community values education or think it's important. So those are just some bigger picture comments mostly for our community, which I think are fairly shared. But it's an interesting story that all of these slides tell. And thank you so much for putting together a really excellent presentation. It is a huge compliment and accomplishment to have no findings from an audit perspective, which is the point of this evening, is when you do have audit findings, sometimes that means we need to do something different or account for something a little differently. And to have a clean bill of health, if you will, is really an accomplishment. So thank you for continuing to work with us. You always do a great job. And thank you, Dr. Swift, Marios, and your team for getting us a clean bill of health, if you will. Thank you.